Your passcode is confirmed.
I'd like to welcome you to our monthly regulatory update and compliance webinar for April of 2015. Should have a good webcast today. Looks like we have strong attendance coming in. So we're going to go ahead and get started here in very short order, but as we always do, all of you have now been placed on mute for the duration of the webcast. Any questions and answers will be answered via the Q&A function that you should see a Q&A box at the right-hand side of your screen. Please type in all questions in that box and submit them, and we will pause at different times throughout the presentation to provide answers to those questions that have been typed in. At the end of the webcast, once we've answered all written Q&A questions, we'll close the webcast out and then unmute all of the lines in case anyone has any follow-up or additional questions they'd like to ask verbally. So I wanted to thank you all for joining us today. All right, we've got 3 different presenters for today's webcast. Myself, I'll be sort of wrapping things up at the end. We've got Eric Votaw, who is our Director of Regulatory Compliance in our Stockton office, and Don Nowotny, who is our Director of CAB Services in our Austin office. So on that note, I'm going to hand things off to Don Nowotny to talk about some issues related to the upcoming NECA CAFICC data collection. So Don, if I could, I'll pass the baton to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chad. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you great, and I'm assuming everyone else can.
Great. Chad asked me to talk about the NECA CAFICC data collection process that we're kind of in the middle of right now. So just want to talk about what the purpose of the data collection effort is, and the purpose is to establish your CAFICC support amount for the tariff year 2015 through 2016. That actually runs from July 1st, 2015 through June 30th, 2016. And the start of the calculation is using your 2011 baseline revenue requirement. And if you'll recall, that is made up of 3 components: your 2011 forecasted interstate switched access revenue requirement, your fiscal year 2011 transitional intrastate billed revenue, and your fiscal year 2011 recip comp billed revenue. The revenue requirement is reduced 5% a year under the FCC rules. We are now in the 4th year of this process. So the revenue requirement will be hit by nearly 20% reduction. It's 18 point something for the 4th year. That's your starting point of your revenue requirement that you can receive in CAFICC support dollars. From that number is there's the deduction for double recovery adjustments based on your 2012 and 2013 cost studies. These are adjustments to your frozen 2011 switched access revenue requirement. And Chad has volunteered to discuss double recovery adjustments in more detail a little later in this webcast. The next thing that's deducted from your revenue requirement number is your estimated revenues for tariff year 2015-2016. That's your total interstate switched access revenue, your transitional intrastate switched access revenue. And the reason it's called transitional and not just terminating is because intrastate switched access revenue under the CAFICC process includes not only your terminating per minute switched access dollars, but also your flat-rated direct trunk transport dollars for those companies that have an access tandem, or if you happen to have a direct trunk to your end office and you're billing direct trunk transport. And finally, the third item is estimated revenues is your reciprocal compensation revenue for 2015-2016 if you have any of that. And then to this number, there is the actual true-up process as part of the CAFICC annual data collection is truing up for tariff year 2013-2014 to your actual revenues that you received during that period of time, less the estimated revenues that were reported back in March of 2013. So there's always a 2-year lag in the true-up from estimates to actuals. So your estimated revenues that you're reporting for this year, for 2015, 2016, those will be trued up to actuals in the data collection in March 2017. So the net of this calculation produces your eligible recovery amount. And in the NECA's process, they calculate an eligible recovery amount separately for interstate, intrastate, and reciprocal compensation. Then from this total eligible recovery amount, you deduct your estimated tariff year 2015-2016 ARC revenues. And keep in mind, beginning July 1, 2015, the residential ARC is scheduled to increase from $1.50 to $2. Same thing for the single line business. The multi-line business last year reached the $3 cap. So this year, the multi-line business rate is not scheduled to increase due to that 1220 cap. And that 1220 cap was the 920 multi-line slick plus $3 multi-line ARC can't exceed the 1220. Some companies may not be able to bill the full ARC revenue of the $2 for residential customers based on the $30 residential rate ceiling. If your local rates plus those other surcharges and taxes hit the $30 rate ceiling, you may not be able to implement the full ARC increase to the $2. Once the ARC revenue is calculated, that's deducted from your eligible recovery amount, and the net difference is your CAFICC support amount for tariff year 2015-2016. The time frame for the data collection is we're in the middle of the data entry inputs. Beginning tomorrow, April 3rd, NECA will lock all data entry to the website, and then next week, between April 6th through April the 10th, they will review the data to determine if there's any glaring errors or variances that need further explanation. So you may be hearing from NECA after about April 10th asking questions about the data that's been put into the system. They'll reopen the website on April 22nd through May 7th to allow you to make corrections or revisions to the data previously reported. And then beginning May 12th through May the 26th, a company officer will have to certify the data that's been reported. And there's 4 certification forms. There's the certification form for accuracy, another form to authorize NECA to act as your agent, another form for that you complied with the rules and that you're eligible to receive CAFICC support, and that you're not seeking duplicative recovery in the state jurisdiction. And then when that's done, on June 16th, when NECA does their annual tariff filing, they will file this CAFICC data with the FCC and with USAC.
Hey, Don, this is Chad. I've got a couple of quick questions for you.
Okay.
Hopefully they're easy ones. So first is, you've indicated that tomorrow NECA will lock the website. At what time do they do that? Are you aware?
I don't know the time. I believe it is midnight Eastern time, but okay, I'm not positive.
That was my understanding as well. My other question really is okay, so tomorrow is the initial deadline for data entry. Should companies be worried out, be stressed if they don't have everything completely fine-tuned or perfect answers to every question at this point? Or is this sort of a best effort time frame, and then we've got an opportunity to fix it later?
That's correct, yeah. It's best effort time frame right now. It will reopen on April 22nd. You can go in and make corrections and finalize numbers. But On May the 7th, around that time period, May 7th, May 8th, the website will lock again, and there will be no opportunity to make any changes. That will be the final numbers. If you go in and look at your data around May the 8th, that will be the final set of numbers that NECA will be filing with the FCC and USAC.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Don. I appreciate that. I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Okay. And some of the observations that we are seeing for our clients this month as we're working on this data is that typically the CAFICC support amounts are going up. There may be some companies that see it going down, but in general, most companies, their CAFICC support dollars are increasing for the 2015-2016 tariff period. And that's primarily due to the continuing decline of minutes of use. Most companies are experiencing minutes of use decline. There are some companies out there that decline is basically stagnant and some even increasing a little bit, but for the majority of the companies, the minutes of use are declining. And the other big thing that's causing the support dollars to go up is the decline in the terminating local switching rate. If you recall that the FCC rules and the transformation order have set a transition for that rate to go to 0. This year we're in the second phase of the transition to the 005 rate. It's 1/3 of the current rate now, less the 005, plus the 005 rate. That's what the new rate will be in July 1st, 2015. July 1st, 2016, the rate will become the 005.005. Then it starts another 3-year transition to get to 0007.007 on July 1st, 2019. And then on July 1st, 2020, that terminating local switching rate goes to 0. And that's for both the interstate and intrastate jurisdictions. Companies have questioned the difference in the interstate billed revenue versus allocated revenue on line 12 of the CAFICC data collection forms. That reflects your forecasted billed interstate revenue, but in their calculation of eligible recovery, NECA uses line 13, your allocated interstate revenue. The difference between those two is primarily NECA's efforts to convert your billed revenue to your revenue requirement. Remember when 2011, the frozen switched access revenue requirement? At that point in time, your revenue requirement, if your revenue requirement was 1% of the total revenue requirement of the pool, that line 13 amount represents 1% of the revenues available to the pool. So it's their effort to convert your billed revenues to your revenue requirement equivalent. And then that's what's subtracted from your baseline interstate switched access revenue requirement to come up with your eligible recovery amount on line 14. And finally, there are some large true-up adjustments for the transitional intrastate revenue. And that's being caused by either forecasted minutes being too high or too low. And this should not be a surprise, but since this true-up has just started last year, this is the second year of the true-up, and it's 2 years behind, there are some pretty significant true-ups that we should be working hard to reduce those in the next year's true-ups. And our recommendation to avoid that is to do a little closer tracking of the forecasted amounts during this 2015-2016 tariff period to the actual revenue that you're reporting to NECA on your EC 1050, so that by the end of June 2016, you'll have a pretty good idea of, okay, well, we forecasted this amount, but we've reported to NEC of this amount, and you can see what your true-up will be in another year when we do the March 2017 CAFICC data reporting. Another issue on intrastate revenue is the calculation of forecasted revenues using option A versus option B. And if you aren't familiar with the two options, option A takes your forecasted terminating intrastate minutes of use times a composite rate to forecast your intrastate revenues. Option B uses your forecasted minutes of use or demand units times the individual rate elements to produce your revenue, what they call the intrastate TRP, Tariff Review Plan worksheet. The option A works well for those companies without access tandems that aren't billing any direct trunk transport revenue. But we would recommend you use option B for those companies with access tandems due to the calculation of direct trunk transport revenue. And how we develop the demand units for direct trunk transport is we take the billed direct trunk transport revenue divided by the direct trunk transport rate during that period of time, and that way that allows you to back into the demand units that you use for forecasting the direct trunk transport revenue for the next tariff period. And Chad, with that, I think that covers all the items that I had on my list.
Okay, great, Don. Well, a couple of things. First, I'm not yet seeing any questions coming in for the Q&A, so we'll let Don off the hook for right now. But certainly, as questions come in throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask questions on Don's CAFICC topic there, and we'll circle back with him. The next item is that I guess it's that time for a poll-in question so that we can make sure that people get their appropriate CPE credit here. So the polling box has come up. You've got 3 minutes to answer, but we'd probably like to move forward a little quicker than that. Pretty straightforward question here. Remember just to click on the answer, click in the circle next to the answer you'd like to select, and then click the submit button. And once you're done with that, you can just click on the X in the polling box, and it should close that panel. Okay, we'll give everyone just a few more seconds here to make sure everyone's paying attention. So again, for those who need CPE, the polling box should be up on the right-hand side of your screen. Please select the answer you'd like by clicking on the circle next to it and click the submit button. So on that note, we will go ahead and close out the polling option. Again, if you do have questions that you'd like to ask throughout the webcast, please use the Q&A function and or the chat function, but the Q&A function should be enabled for you. So moving on here, I'm going to pass things over to Eric Votaw to talk about a couple of other compliance reporting deadlines that we have coming up in the near future. Eric?
Thanks, Chad. As we've done in the past, we're going to go over real briefly what we've just finished and then talk about what's coming up very quickly and on the horizon for things for people to start thinking about. Yesterday, our 499A was due. As people were inputting this, they probably noticed that the screens and process that we were using from USAC changed quite a bit. Did take a little bit of getting used to. With this new filing system that USAC has us using, we're not looking so much directly at the lines, but it does have a lot more checks in it, and it probably took people a little bit more time to get used to inputting it. And hopefully, with this next Q filing that comes up in May, it'll go faster. Some of the things that we'd like to remind you of is that if you did not get all of your financials completed for this April 1st filing, we do have until March 31st of next year to make any revisions. And not to worry about it, but hopefully everybody got their filings in on that April 1st deadline. So moving along into what we have coming up very quickly with this month will be our switch access revenue true-up. Sometimes this is called the calendarization. This is not required for our special access, but this is a true-up that we need to do of our revenues for our switched access. This is taking our realized revenue from July 1, 2013 to June 30th, 2014 calendar. Some billing systems are billing in the middle of the month or mid-month, and what we're required to do, FCC has a requirement that we recognize our revenue on a calendar basis. This is due by April lock. NECA has sent out a couple of emails on it, and if you need any assistance with it, we're available to help you with that. And then also coming up this month, due a little bit sooner than April lock, will be the NECA Company Services Questionnaire. This is due by April 17th. It is required by cost companies to be completed. NECA has sent that notice out a couple of times. Really what they're looking for in this is the technology that's deployed in your network, and they're looking for you to forecast out any next year demand. This will help them with forecasting out revenue requirements and pricing. And we'll move along to a couple of things that we have coming up on the horizon very shortly. One of them that I made mention of a little bit ago is the next 499Q that's coming up. That will be due May 1st. We also have our second view of the ICC CAP that Don talked about. That will be due on May 7th. And then we'll have CAFICC certifications due on May 26th. As these dates are moving along and coming up closer, we'll be sending out notifications to remind everybody. And then on the horizon that'll be coming up, I think if you look at USAC's website, it's around 90 days is there's a countdown calendar or clock that they have on the FCC Form 481. That's going to be due July 1st. That we have coming, that'll be coming up, and we have some new reporting requirements this year on it. This year we're going to have to update our progress report. We're also going to have to report our CAPEX and OPEX and the different support mechanisms that we've received. And what has a lot of people a little bit worried this year will be the progress report maps that are coming up. And to that, there's some thoughts that we've been putting into this and some ideas that things to start thinking about that are coming up on the Form 481. So this year we're going to need to show progress that we've made on our 5-year plans. And one of the things that we have to explain on our progress report is whether or not we've met the targets. There's no right or wrong answer, but what the FCC does want to see is that if you haven't made your targets, you need to give an explanation as to why. In some instances, it could be that your demands have required that you pull your CAPEX dollars and reallocate them to a different location as opposed to the project that you had mapped out. There could be natural disasters that have come up. I know there on the eastern side of the country, you guys had a pretty rough winter, and some of your dollars may have been reallocated to different projects based on weather and things beyond your control that have required you to reallocate your targets. You need to show the USF that you've received, and so what they're going to want to see in your forecast is a breakout of the USF that you've received with the different support mechanisms, and we're going to have to show how those support mechanisms were used. And this year we'll also have a breakout of the CAPEX and the OPEX. So they'll want to see what the CAPEX and OPEX that you've received, that you've used for this current year, and then we're also mapping that out over the next 5 years. So as we make these progress updates, each year we budget what we think the CAPEX and OPEX will be, and then make those adjustments as we update our progress plans. And the one that has a lot of people nervous is the maps detailing the progress towards meeting our planned targets. The one thing that the FCC has not given us is a definition of how they want to see those maps. So at this point, we don't have a specific format defined. I know that USAC this last week issued the updated questionnaire for the 481, so there's some instruction booklet that's out on USAC's website, and I just double-checked it. There still is no specific format on how we're supposed to update the maps. So as we work through these next few months and getting it completed, we'll be working with people to answer questions on that. And then the other thing is that we want to remind people of is that there is a requirement to make sure that your progress reports include the voice and broadband. One of the things that USAC's been coming back on, and we've been seeing it with some of their checks of last year's 481, is whether or not people had broke out broadband and voice networks. So we want to just remind everybody to make sure that as you're making your progress updates that you do make an allocation and reference to the voice and the broadband requirements that are out there.
All right, great. Well, Eric, we had a good question that just came in, so good and timely. So actually, I guess our next polling question is coming up right now. So let's go ahead and answer that real quick, and then we'll get to a good question we've got for Eric. So again, when it comes to the polling question, just click on the circle next to the response you'd like to give, click on Submit, and once you're done with that, you can click the X in the top right corner of the box to close that panel out. But again, remember that if you do want CPE, you have to respond to at least 3 out of the 4 questions, polling questions that'll come up during the presentation. So give people a couple more seconds to finish that up, and then I will go ahead and answer or ask Eric the one question that's come in so far. If there are others, please just go ahead and type them into the Q&A function. So I think we've probably had enough time with the polling question. Eric, here's the question that came in. If you did not have any projects with a completion date scheduled in the first half of 2015, do you just indicate projects with a later completion date are in progress as scheduled? So obviously the reporting is due July 1st of 2015. How do people respond to projects that aren't yet started, I guess?
If they're not yet started, then they still remain in progress is the way I would answer that. Because we do have a number of projects that won't be started until the second half of the year. So if they're in progress, that's a sufficient answer. It's a very good question.
And so as I'm reading through this question, something just pops to my mind, and I'm not sure I'm reading this right, but my understanding is here at July 1st, 2015, we'll be reporting on progress through December 31st of 2014. Is that correct?
Yes, we are reporting everything a year in arrears. Okay.
So in terms of the progress report, anything related to the first half of 2015, I would then interpret that we don't have to respond to that. The progress report, we would just give a status update as to where we are at 12/31/2014 with those projects. Whether started or not, we provide an explanation as to how they're going and when they'll be completed.
Correct. We are, again, yes, we are reporting everything a year in arrears.
Okay, great. So I hope that that was responsive to the question asked, and please, as we go throughout the presentation, feel free to ask questions on any topic that we're covering today. So I know there's not really a whole lot going on right now. There's some big projects, 499, the Form 481 coming up here soon, but not a volume of reporting requirements. So on that note, we're going to shift gears to a bit of a regulatory update on a couple of topics that people have been asking a lot of questions about of late. So we wanted to go a bit deeper into these 2 items. The first one, as Dawn mentioned earlier, has to do with double recovery. And a lot of people are still a bit confused about why we're calculating double recovery, how we calculate it, and where exactly or how exactly it impacts you at the end of the day. So first of all, just sort of wanted to start with, what do the rules say? And I'm not going to read through this word for word, but really it's all about costs that are included in your revenue baseline. So your revenue baseline was established back in 2012 based on your average costs that you reported to NECA for tariff purposes for 2011 and 12. So those are forecasts of costs that would be incurred in 2011 and 2012. So it's costs that were included in your revenue baseline that cannot be recovered through other rate elements or other jurisdictional revenues because it would then produce double recovery. So your eligible recovery or your revenue baseline that was set back in 2012 included switched access rates, it included your access recovery charges, and it included Connect America funding. So it was all of those components that would make up your cost recovery for your frozen revenue baseline. So if your switched access rates and your access recovery charges don't recover the total, then the Connect America funding will make up for the difference. And so as a result of that, any costs that were included in that 2011-2012 revenue baseline will be fully recovered, less 5% a year. So when we do the annual cost study and we're defining the revenue requirement for other services or other rate elements that aren't covered or aren't part of that revenue baseline, if costs are being assigned to those different rate elements or services, you may end up having double recovery. So in that cost study process, if your switched access costs get shifted over to special access or DSL, your subscriber line charge or ICLS or your carrier common line revenue requirement, or to intrastate revenue requirement, then you may have double recovery. So that's why we need to continue digging into this. So the next question that a lot of people ask or that we look into is, how do I identify any double recovery that I may have? And so really what we always recommend to people is that you need to focus on changes in methodology, changes in how you're doing the cost study. So what you're going to do is you're going to look back to your 2011 and 2012 methodologies that you used in preparing those NECA forecasts. So accounting methodologies, cost study and separations categorization methodologies, network configurations, things along those lines to determine if anything has changed that would drive a change in your switched access cost recovery. And so again, you're looking at the same cost that you incurred during that time frame being treated differently. So if you have normal increases or decreases in costs, expenses have gone up. We've hired additional employees or we've lost employees. The costs have gone up or down. Those items are just normal course of business. It's not a change in methodology, so they would not be double recovery. So some examples of that is you may add new investment in plant, or you may retire existing investment in plant. That's not a change in methodology, so it doesn't constitute double recovery. I already mentioned the growth or reduction in expenses. And then you could also have variations or variances in how your costs are recorded due to a different time reporting methodology. So those are items that are generally not considered for double recovery. So we've talked a little bit about what doesn't cause double recovery. Let's focus in now on what does cause double recovery. And really, again, it all goes back to, have you changed the methodology that you initially used to establish that revenue baseline in your 2011 and 2012 NECA forecast? So some of the major items that we see driving double recovery are items like network design or reconfigurations. You've retired remote switches and you've replaced them with concentrators. So the retirement and the replacement of the investment doesn't constitute double recovery. But what does constitute double recovery is the fact that the fiber route, the inter-exchange route that connects the remote location back to the host switch used to be host remote investment, and now it's subscriber loop investment. and so you have a different or a revised categorization methodology or categorization of that investment that was existing when the revenue baseline was established, and so that would cause double recovery on your cable and wire facility categorization, or it could. You may have accounting entries that have changed over time, and so, for example, you have the exact same cost that you're now accounting for differently. So a really good example of this is SS7 related expenses. There is some interpretation to be had that SS7 expenses can be recorded in either the switching or the transmission expense accounts. And so as a result of the freezing of the switched access revenue requirement, many companies initially had thought, well, we can transfer that expense from switching to transmission and get better cost recovery. Well, the end result would be double recovery. That SS7 expense is included in your 2011-2012 frozen revenue baseline. If you shift the cost recovery over to another account and get additional cost recovery, you'll get it twice, once via the revenue baseline and once via the new treatment. And then another example is cost study categorization. In the cost study, there are a lot of things that need to be done in order to categorize your central office equipment and cable and wire facilities. And so differing methodologies that can be used for each type of investment. And if you change the categorization methodology, there's a possibility that you could end up with double recovery of that, because that investment or that categorized plant was included in your switched access revenue requirement in 2011 or 12, and now as a result of that recategorization, it may be moved to a common line or some other rate element. In addition, corrections of errors could cause double recovery. I had something accounted for incorrectly previously, or I had some categorization done incorrectly previously. Well, regardless of right or wrong, it's included in that frozen revenue requirement, and you're getting cost recovery of it through the CAFICC process. So if you correct those errors, which you should, make sure that your cost study is correct, you then just need to recognize the fact that you'll have double recovery, and you need to reduce the amount of CAFICC support you receive so that you don't get that recovery two different times. And then finally, any changes in study area boundaries. If you acquire or sell exchanges, that's going to change the costs that are included in your switched access revenue baseline, and so you'll want to make sure that you calculate double recovery for those as well. How is double recovery calculated? I'll try not to bore you with the details and just touch on a few different steps in the process. Typically, it's your cost consultant that's going to perform that calculation. And so a couple of different things that need to be done. First, you have to have two different cost studies to compare to each other. So you use the current year cost study, or whatever year you're analyzing the double recovery on. So you'll run the cost study once using the original methodology and a second time using the revised methodology. So if the new methodology or the change that you've made produces a lower switched access revenue requirement, you may have double recovery because you're seeing costs shifting from switched access likely to a different service or rate element. So if that's the case, if you see a lower switched access revenue requirement, you need to determine the difference in the switched access revenue requirement between those two methodologies. You need to then calculate the percentage variance from the original methodology. So the percentage variance divided by the original revenue requirement for switched access. Whatever percentage that is, you'll apply that percentage variance to the frozen switched access revenue baseline. So if I run my two cost studies, my revised methodology results in a reduced revenue requirement for switched access. I take the variance between the two, I divide it by my original switched access revenue requirement, and let's say, for example, that produces a 10% variance. I then take that 10% variance factor and I multiply it by my original switched access revenue baseline, and then I phase that down by 5% a year because my cost recovery for switched access and that revenue baseline is going down by 5% a year. So the impact of double recovery will also go down by 5% each year. So a fairly complex calculation. NECA has a work paper on how that should be done. I'm showing it here on the screen. I know it's a little bit complicated, but at the top you can see that there's a switched access revenue requirement of $470,000. I compare that to my original methodology where I had a revenue requirement of $520,000. So that results in a $50,000 variance, or 9.6% of the original. I then multiply that by my frozen baseline revenue requirement from 2011, which is $455,000. So my double recovery is $43,750. Now I'm going to phase that down or reduce it by 5% each year going forward. So at the bottom of the schedule, you can see how that flows through the process. In the first year, it's showing that there's only a half a year impact there because we're looking at double recovery for July of 2012 through June of 2013. I'm calculating this double recovery based on my 2013 cost study, so it's really only half a year of impact. And then each year thereafter, you see how that $43,750 of double recovery will impact the tariff year, July 2013 through June 2014, and so on until you get to July 2015 through June 2016. So this is NECA's schedule that is showing how the double recovery is to be calculated. Okay, so some concerns though with that double recovery calculation, and we and others have had some discussions with NECA. Certainly not going to put any words in anyone's mouth and say that NECA is committed to making changes to this calculation, but they're looking at potential changes to the calculation based on some concerns that have been raised. And it's primarily driven by the fact that switched access revenue requirements, actual switched access revenue requirements, are declining, and in many cases significantly so. Companies are converting their networks from hosts or remotes to concentrators, and switches are being retired or they're becoming fully depreciated. So there's a lot of different reasons why those switched access revenue requirements are reducing. There are reduced switch maintenance expenses in many situations. We also have alternate switching arrangements where companies have retired existing switches and now are leasing switching on a per minute of use basis from a neighboring company, and maybe have reduced their cost associated with that. So a lot of legitimate reasons why we're seeing reductions in the switched access revenue requirement. However, the result of that is that small changes due to double recovery or due to changed methodologies are becoming a much larger percentage of the revenue requirement. So if I go back to my example here before, if my 2013 revenue requirement was $100,000 in my recategorization, or prior to recategorization, it was $150,000, I would see a 33% reduction. As a result of that fairly nominal change, I would then reduce my frozen baseline and the support I'm eligible for by 1/3. So some significant concerns there that there are some unintended results coming out of this calculation formula that NECA has put together and vetted completely with the FCC and has the FCC's approval. So what we're seeing in a few limited circumstances is that there's some very significant calculated double recovery. So NECA is studying the issue further. They've asked us and other consulting firms to provide some documentation behind how the double recovery is being calculated and the impacts on companies so they can further analyze the right way of approaching this and whether it makes sense to discuss a potential change with the FCC. So more to come on that, but we do have some concerns that double recovery could be producing some anomalous results in a few circumstances. So how is double recovery reported? I think Dawn touched on this fairly well earlier, but I'll just hit on a few things here. In the NECA CAFICC true-up and data collection, there are several different line items that involve double recovery. In the intrastate portion of the CAFICC data collection, there is a line 13C that is supposed to include intrastate double recovery. This isn't a real likely event, but you'll need to look at it and make sure it's not the case. In cases where potentially you're going through a rate case or there's some changes in your intrastate cost recovery, you may go through a rate case, you may have a state universal service funding proceeding that provides you a greater cost recovery for costs that have been shifted from the interstate jurisdiction. You may have double recovery as a result of that. If so, you'll need to assess what that amount is, report it, and reduce your interstate cost recovery or your CAFICC support to reflect that. From an interstate perspective, line 14A is the total amount of interstate double recovery that you've calculated using that prior worksheet that I showed you. Line 14B requires that you check all items that apply for the different causes or different types of double recovery that you may have. And so what they list are changes in categorization, corrections of errors, or changes to study area boundaries. And so you may have some changes in categorization, you may have some changes in accounting methodologies or other items, in which case you would check the first box and then the other box. So just making sure that you're telling NECA and the FCC what's driving those events of double recovery. So following that up or continuing on that, line 14C is taking and showing how that double recovery assignment is then allocated to different services or different rate elements. So line 14C1 is saying how much of the double recovery has been assigned to interstate special access or DSL. Line 14C2 is showing how much of the double recovery has been assigned to interstate common line. And then the remainder goes to line 14C3, which is other, which likely means that the interstate switched access cost has been assigned to the intrastate jurisdiction in your cost study. So, just need to make sure that, and if we scroll back just a little bit to this calculation here, you can see that there are lines for common line special access. So there's $50,000 of double recovery, $14,000 was assigned to common line, $20,000 assigned to special access. The remainder of $16,000 would be assigned to other. Okay, so line 14D is the calculation of the actual double recovery. So it's just taking line 14A and adjusting it by 5% for each year. And it does include any prior year's calculation of double recovery adjusted for by 5% for each year. And so then sort of shifting gears to what is the impact on revenues? What does this really mean to you as a company? Well, double recovery is a direct reduction in the amount of CAFICC support that you're eligible to receive. Basically what it says is that, the revenue that you're receiving that revenue from another source, and so the revenue that you receive from that other source, it's going to reduce the amount of support you receive, but your total revenues should remain the same. We've shifted the cost recovery from the CAFICC to the other source. As I mentioned a few times, it is reduced by 5% per year, which is consistent with the revenue baseline, phases down by 5% a year. And one of the things that's important to understand is that costs assigned to special access or DSL or common line are still under rate of return regulation. We're still calculating an annual revenue requirement, and there are means in place to allow you to recover that revenue requirement subject to the pool's current rate of return. So while the double recovery amount, the switched access impacts, decline by 5% each year, the positive impact that you've shifted to common line or special access do not decline each year. So even if you have double recovery, there may be some small positive impact of that in the 5% that doesn't reduce each year. The true-ups that come through as a result of the CAFICC true-up process are paid back through the pooling process beginning July 1st of this year and flowing through June 30th of the following year. So on that note, there have been a couple of additional questions that have come in. Going to shift gears to another topic here shortly, but we've got a couple of other questions that have come in, so we'll answer those, and then we'll do our third polling question. So the first question is, I believe this is for Eric, related to the FCC Form 481 and the 5-year progress report. And it says, do we report investments made by the ISP but not the telco? So in your progress report and your 5-year plan, are you reporting telco investments and expenses and or ISP investments and expenses?
You're reporting telco investments. Usually it's telco investments because that's where you're getting your support from.
Right. Okay, great. And I haven't read through this other question yet, so I'll have to get through it and see who it's really for here. So the question is, what would happen if we lost special access circuits because a cell tower left and the allocation causes a shift from interstate to state? So I think this is a question related to double recovery. That is a normal course of business, so long as you aren't changing the methodology that you use to categorize your cable and wire facilities and central office equipment related to that wideband service. There is no change in methodology. It's sort of a normal course of business change, in which case you would not have an incident of double recovery. Again, it's really important to think about the fact that it's a methodology change. It's some change that you have intentionally made to your network or to your accounting or to your cost study procedures that drive that. The normal course of business things don't have an impact on it. But it's a good question. So on that note, why don't we go ahead and do our third polling question so that everyone can get their CPE. So a pretty tough one here, true or false question. And it looks like each time we come up, our time limit's getting shorter and shorter. So click your response in the circle next to the response you want, hit submit, and then when you're done, you can just close it by clicking on the X at the top right. Give people just a few more seconds to make sure they're paying attention before we jump to the next topic here. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and keep moving. So the last topic I wanted to talk about was competitive overlap. I've had a lot of questions coming in, a lot of people concerned with what's currently going on related to competitive overlap. And sort of two different things that I want to discuss here in relation to it. The first is the FCC is currently identifying study areas that they believe to have 100% competitive overlap based on information that they're seeing from the FCC Form 477, as well as the study area boundary maps that have been submitted to the FCC. So they're doing an overlay of those two and saying, hey, here are the study areas that we believe to be at or near 100% overlap. My understanding is they have provided some information to NTCA and potentially others as to companies they're seeing that may be at risk for competitive overlap. The FCC's list of those entities that do have 100% or near 100% competitive overlap will be published later in 2015. And remember that the big issue here is if a company is 100% overlapped by a competitor that provides both voice and broadband at the required speeds, will lose 100% of their high-cost support. Now, that reduction in high-cost support will be phased in, or support will be phased out over a 3-year time frame beginning in 2016. And each year thereafter, the FCC will further analyze whether additional companies have 100% overlap by a competitive provider. And so even if you're safe in 2015, competition could increase over time, and there could be risk in the future. The FCC has indicated previously that they're looking at reducing support in areas where there's less than 100% overlap. They have not gotten to a final solution there, so we don't know if or when they're going to apply a reduction in support for less than 100% overlap. But something that's important to consider that may have some significant implications on your company. So we do have some pretty significant concerns with this competitive overlap. Obviously, there are companies at risk of losing a lot of support, and so we want to make sure that the FCC is approaching it in the proper way. The FCC Form 477 being used as some of the underlying documentation here is problematic. Some of the things that we've run across in reviewing this with companies out there is that the fixed wireless reporting is pretty suspect in a lot of areas. In many situations, they may have their tower and they'll draw a big concentric circle around that tower and report everything in that concentric circle as being served. Well, when people actually call at the far reaches of those concentric circles to say, hey, can I get service in this area? They say, no, we don't provide service here. So we know that there's some problems with how the fixed wireless carriers are reporting their coverage. There will be an appeals process, and so for those who do have significant competitive overlap, you'll need to start gathering information about who those competitors are and where their service territory really resides, and make sure that you're prepared to appeal their claims via the FCC Form 477. We have also run into a couple of situations. I would say these are fairly limited but somewhat concerning, where an ILEC-owned or their affiliated company's fixed wireless or cable modem service is considered as competitive overlap. Now, the fixed wireless and cable provider have to provide voice as well as broadband at the supported speeds, but if that is the case, then those carriers would be considered to competitively overlap your company. Now, one of the big problems we've seen with that, again, with a limited number of companies, is there's some folks out there who are using fixed wireless local loops to provide both voice and broadband. In the FCC Form 477, it's our interpretation and understanding that you're required to report that as fixed wireless service. When you do so, then it's shown as fixed wireless competition and not part of your DSL telco service offering. Another area of concern is that the competitive overlap is determined at the census block level, and so if a competitor claims to provide service within a given census block, the entire census block is deemed to be competitive. So some concerning areas there, most definitely. So shifting gears a little bit, and it's directly related to this, but some cost model implications as we dig deeper and deeper into and understand more the alternative Connect America model, trying to understand the results of that. One of the primary drivers of support in that model is the amount of competitive overlap that a company has. So any census blocks with fixed wireless or cable competition may not be eligible for support. So one big concern there. Many companies are finding, as we dig deeper and deeper into that the competitive overlap appears to be overstated, again, potentially for some of the reasons that I've already indicated. And then finally, and I pretty well touched on this already, but companies that have their own fixed wireless local loops that they're providing regulated voice and broadband services over are showing competitive overlap as a result of their own service. We did confirm this via some discussions with CostQuest and the FCC that if a company were reporting regulated services as fixed wireless on their FCC Form 477, they would cross-reference that company's study area code to determine whether they provide voice and the supported broadband speeds within the state. If so, and that would, I think, pretty much always be the case with a rural ILAC, then that fixed wireless service is considered to be competitive overlap in their own study area. Obviously, that's a big problem, something that we likely need to get the FCC to understand for those companies in that situation. So, like I've indicated, there's some fairly significant concerns because in the cost model, some of the different scenarios that they look at would exclude census blocks where there's competitive overlap from the calculation of support. So many companies that are seeing reductions in support under the Connect America model, the primary driver is that competitive overlap. So some recommendations here. If you have concerns over competitive overlap, if you think that your study area may be substantially overlapped, you can get some information out of the Connect America model to show what census blocks the FCC has indicated do have either fixed wireless or cable modem competitors that also offer voice and broadband at the supported speeds. So that's one good source of information to pull information on the census blocks that are competitive. You do want to verify that any providers that are reporting in your study area on the FCC Form 477 or the National Broadband Map that they've reported availability. You want to verify that they truly are there or determine whether you need to be ready to appeal their claims of availability. Certainly, as always, recommend that companies consider communicating with the FCC and or their national associations any concerns that they have with the data and or errors that have been made, that you believe have been made. And then finally, there will be an appeals process. The CAF Phase 2 appeals process for price cap carriers just wrapped up. The FCC released some results of that the other day. They analyzed somewhere in the range of 95,000 different census blocks for competitive overlap to determine if what the data they were seeing was accurate or not, and they did make some significant changes. Some were changed to non-competitive, some were changed to being competitive. So we want to make sure that that information is correct. So appeals process, certainly the FCC later in 2015 is going to publish their list of companies that have 100% competitive overlap. If your company is on that list, you'll want to make sure that you participate in that appeals process. In addition, if and when the alternative Connect America model is adopted for use by rate of return carriers and you are looking at the potential of opting in or out of that support, you'd want to make sure that it's properly calculated. And again, the competitive overlap being a very significant driver. And so on that note, I think we're going to go ahead with our final polling question. I'll then answer any additional questions that are listed on the Q&A function, and we'll then close things out and open the lines back up for live comment. So again, for the polling question, click on the circle next to the answer you like best, click on the submit button, and then when you're done, you can click on the X at the top right corner to close that panel out. And just as a reminder, I'm understanding that you need to make sure you click submit on your answer to the polling question. If you don't, it won't count, and you need to have 3 out of the 4 questions responded to in order to get the CPE. So please make sure you click on the submit button. Okay, so looking to see if there are any additional questions that have come in. There is one question, and we get this question fairly often. It's, can you please put these slides up on your website at the conclusion of your presentation? The way that we handle that is each webcast is recorded and is made available on the website and on our Moss Adams Telecom website. It usually takes a week to 2 weeks to get there. I won't bore you with the details as to why, but there's some editing process that goes on before it can be posted to the website. So unfortunately, it doesn't become available immediately. If you do need the slides for some reason, please let me know, and I'll try to get a copy to you sooner than that. So I'm not seeing any additional questions coming in via the Q&A. But while I'm wrapping things up, if you still do have questions, please type them in, and we'll make sure that we get them answered. But if there are no additional questions, first, wanted to thank you all very much for your participation in these webcasts. We've gotten very positive feedback. We think that it's a good way of communicating with our clients in the industry. If you do have topics that you'd like us to discuss on any particular webcast, please let us know, and we'll do our very best to get them incorporated. And on that note, if there are no additional questions, and I'm not seeing any at this point, wanted to thank you all very much, and we look forward to our next webcast in early May. We'll be sending out an email with invitations to that a week or so in advance of the webcast. So once again, thank you all very much, and have a great month.